A modern hiker with GPS, freeze-dried meals, and a satellite beacon gets lost for 3 days and needs a helicopter to get him out. In 1832, a mountain man named Jedediah walks into the same range with a knife, 50 feet of rawhide cord, and a tin cup. He stays 8 months. He doesn't just survive. He comes out with beaver pelts worth a small fortune and eats fresh meat most nights. How? It wasn't the equipment. It was knowing how to set a trap. More than that, it was understanding animals well enough that a loop of string could put food on the ground. The mountain man didn't haul survival gear into the mountains. He carried knowledge of how animals moved, where they'd step, what would spook them. He read tracks and terrain the way you'd read street signs. A bent twig told him what passed through yesterday. His snares weren't desperate rigging. They were physics and timing, and a kind of intimacy with the woods that most people today couldn't manage even with a manual. This is the story of how the best trappers in American history turned empty forest into a supply line using rope, sticks, and enough sharp thinking to keep them fed where others starved or froze. The American Rockies in the 1830s weren't scenery. They wanted you dead. Winter hit 30 below and sat there for months. Snow buried trails under 4 feet of powder. Creeks turned to stone. The land stretched out huge and cold and completely indifferent to whether you made it through February. A mountain man stepped into that, knowing his traps were the difference between eating and freezing. He went after 2 kinds of animals for 2 reasons. Beaver was money. A good pelt, what they called a plew, brought $6 at Rendezvous. That bought powder, lead, coffee, tobacco for months. Beaver was the long game, the slow pileup of wealth dragged out of frozen streams, one skin at a time. But Beaver didn't cook up tonight. For that he needed rabbit, squirrel, grouse, marmot, anything small enough to snare and eat before dark. These weren't bonus kills. This was staying alive. You could go days without beaver and just be broke. Days without food, and you were done. He worked alone. Rendezvous brought trappers together once a year for a few loud weeks of trading and drinking, but that was it. The rest of the time, he walked his line by himself. No one to help if he rolled an ankle. No backup if his lungs started filling with fluid. No second guess on where the next snare should go. What he knew kept him alive. What he got wrong could kill him, and no one would find out till spring. That kind of alone doesn't really exist anymore. Every choice mattered. Every trap was a test. Set the snare too high, and the rabbit ducks under. Put your deadfall on soft ground, and the trigger slips. Forget to cover your scent, and everything in a quarter mile knows you've been through. No do-overs. No backup plan. No helicopter coming if things went sideways. Just a man, a mountain, and the question of whether he was smarter than the cold. The trap began in the mind, not in the hands. Before a mountain man touched cordage or carved a trigger stick, he spent hours reading what the wilderness had written. A track in the mud wasn't just a footprint. It told him size, weight, speed, direction. The depth showed whether the animal was running or walking. The sharpness of the edges revealed how recently it passed. A bent blade of grass, a broken twig, these marked where the animal turned. He learned this language through immersion. A fox track showed 5 toes and claw marks in a narrow line, the gait of a hunter moving with purpose. Rabbit tracks appeared in paired clusters, hind feet landing ahead of front feet, the pattern of a prey animal built for sudden bursts. Deer hooves left crescents, pressed deep in soft earth, their paths meandering near browse lines, where they fed on low shrubs. The mountain man didn't just identify these marks. He used them to predict where the animal would move next. Animal behavior became his obsession because it had to. Every species followed patterns carved by instinct and terrain. Rabbits preferred the cover of brush, but needed open ground to detect predators, so they traveled edges, the boundary between safety and visibility. Beaver chose the deepest parts of streams where lodges offered protection and water provided escape routes. Marten hunted along fallen logs where squirrels and mice sheltered. These weren't random movements. They were habitual routes, and habits were vulnerabilities a trapper could exploit. he placed his traps where terrain and instinct intersected. A narrow gap between two rocks where a rabbit had no choice but to pass through. A fallen log crossing a creek where a mink would naturally climb to avoid wet ground. A game trail worn smooth by months of repeated use, the path of least resistance that deer returned to because evolution rewarded efficiency. The trap wasn't scattered randomly across the forest. It waited at the precise point where geography forced the animal into a decision the trapper had already made for it. But reading sign and understanding behavior meant nothing if the animal smelled him first. Human scent carried for hundreds of yards on the wind, a chemical signature that screamed danger to every creature with a functioning nose. The mountain man's greatest technical challenge wasn't building the trap. It was erasing himself from it. He stood in freezing water to set snares near creek banks, letting the current wash his scent downstream. He rubbed his hands with fir needles, crushed sage, and mud dug from the stream bottom. He stored his traps in smoke from fires built with green pine boughs, coating the metal in a layer of scent that belonged to the forest. For beaver, he went further, applying castoreum, the musky secretion from the animal's own scent glands, directly to the trap site. The beaver didn't smell a man. It smelled a rival. The trapper couldn't afford to smell like coffee, tobacco, or sweat. He had to smell like stone, water, and wood. His hands cracked and bled from the cold water. His fingers went numb, carving triggers in sub-zero air. But the discomfort was the cost of invisibility, and invisibility was the cost of survival. The simplest trap was a loop. Sinew, rawhide, or later brass wire tied into a slipknot and hung at exactly the right height above a game trail. The rabbit ran. Its head went through the loop. The noose tightened. A bent sapling lashed to the trigger yanked the animal skyward, snapped its neck, and hoisted the body above scavengers. Death was instant. The mechanism was elegant. Making it work required absolute precision. The snare worked because the mountain man understood placement, presentation, and physics. Placement meant finding the trail the animal already used, not where it might go, but where it had gone a dozen times before. Presentation meant hiding the loop so the rabbit saw nothing wrong, done by weaving small sticks into a narrow funnel that guided the head straight into the opening, without spooking it. Physics meant setting the tension of the bent sapling just right, enough force to kill instantly, but not so much it snapped the cordage or flung the animal clear. He carved the funnel from green twigs pushed into the ground at angles that narrowed the path to one opening. The loop hung there at head height for a rabbit, adjusted by species, lower for squirrel, higher for fox. The trigger was a notched peg holding the sapling's tension until the slightest pressure released it. When the animal's head entered the snare and pulled the loop tight, the peg slipped free. The sapling whipped upward. The trap turned stored energy into lethal speed in a fraction of a second. For larger game, gravity replaced spring tension. The deadfall trap used a flat rock or heavy log held above bait by a trigger so sensitive that a touch collapsed it. The most common design was the figure 4 trigger, named for its shape when assembled. 3 sticks carved with precise notches locked together at right angles. Vertical post, horizontal bait stick, diagonal lever. The weight of the rock rested on this arrangement. When an animal bumped the bait stick, the geometry failed. The lever fell. The rock dropped. The figure 4 needed a knife and an understanding of how weight distributed. The vertical post bore the load. The bait stick had to be long enough to keep the animal's body under the fall zone when it reached for food. The diagonal lever connected them at an angle that held under pressure, but gave way under disruption. Each stick was carved to fit the others with woodworking precision. Too loose, and the trigger collapsed early. Too tight, and it wouldn't release when triggered. The mountain man tested it a dozen times before leaving it set, shaving notches with his blade until the balance was perfect. These basic traps fed him daily. But his professional tool was steel. The leg-hold trap, with its spring-loaded jaws and chain anchor, was what filled his pack with beaver pelts worth real money. He set these underwater at the entrances to beaver lodges, placing them on the muddy bottom where the animal's front foot would step as it came out. A dab of castoreum on a nearby stick drew the beaver close. The trap snapped shut. The chain, weighted with a stone, dragged the beaver into deep water, where it drowned quickly and left the pelt intact. The steel trap meant capital investment and specialized manufacture. The snare and deadfall meant knowledge. One needed a blacksmith and cash. The other needed observation and a sharp edge. Both needed the same core skill: the ability to think like the animal, to predict its path, and to place death there so subtly that instinct walked straight into calculation. Every morning started with the walk. Miles of trapline through forest and creek bottom, each set a question waiting for an answer. The mountain man moved through pre-dawn darkness, checking snares he'd placed days before, never knowing what he'd find. A fat rabbit hanging limp meant breakfast. An empty loop meant the animal slipped through or never came. A sprung trigger with no body meant something bigger stole his catch overnight. Then there were the worst finds. A trap set for marmot could catch a young wolf by mistake. A deadfall meant for raccoon could pin a badger that was still alive and furious when he showed up. These weren't hypotheticals. A cornered predator with a broken leg fought like something with nothing left to lose. The trapper approached every set with his knife already out, reading the scene before he got close enough to be in danger. When the trap worked, the real work started. The animal wasn't just one meal. It was raw material for a dozen uses in a world where nothing could be wasted because nothing could be replaced. He skinned carefully, keeping the hide intact for clothing or trade. The meat got butchered and either cooked right away or dried into jerky that would last weeks. Fat was rendered into tallow for waterproofing boots and oiling traps. Sinew from the back and legs became cordage stronger than plant fiber. Bones were split for marrow, then carved into awls, needles, and trigger parts for future traps. This wasn't sentiment. It was survival math. In a landscape where resupply meant a year's journey to St. Louis, every ounce of material had to do multiple jobs. A beaver provided a pelt worth $6, 2 pounds of meat, tail fat prized for its richness, teeth for leatherworking tools, and castoreum for baiting future traps. Waste wasn't inefficient. It was slow suicide. The mountain man era lasted barely 3 decades. By the early 1840s, beaver populations had collapsed from overharvesting. At the same time, European fashion shifted from felt hats made of beaver fur to silk hats that needed no pelts at all. The economic foundation of the fur trade vanished. The men who'd spent years reading animal sign and setting snares in freezing water found their skills suddenly worthless in market terms. But the knowledge survived. These same trappers became the scouts and guides who led wagon trains across the continent. Their ability to read terrain, find water, and live off the land made them essential to settlers who saw wilderness as an obstacle to survive rather than a system to understand. The maps they carried existed only in their heads, drawn from years of walking every mountain pass and creek crossing between the Missouri River and the Pacific coast. Cunning that had gone into trapping now went into exploration, and the nation moved west on trails they opened. The simple snare, that loop of cordage on a game trail, outlived the fur trade by centuries. It stayed the fundamental survival tool because it required nothing but knowledge to create and patience to use well. Steel traps rusted, guns ran out of ammunition, but a man who understood animal behavior and could carve a figure 4 trigger from green wood could eat anywhere forests grew and animals moved. That knowledge, sharpened through necessity in the hardest classroom on the continent, was what the mountain men left behind when the beaver ran out and the era ended. The mountain men are gone. But what they knew hasn't disappeared. They proved something in those mountains that had nothing to do with how strong their rope was, or how sharp they could whittle a trigger. They proved that if you understand how things work, how animals think, how weather moves, where a trail leads, and why, you can survive almost anywhere. Knowledge like that doesn't need to be carried. It just goes with you.